In history, there are moments when a darkness so silent falls that it feels as if someone is watching you even in your sleep. Because not all rulers brought light, some rulers left behind only fear, blood, and the scent of destruction. Tonight, we will step into that deep shadow, where stand the 9 most terrifying rulers in history. Rulers whose very names made kingdoms tremble, and whose cruelty was as boundless as the darkness of night. So, dim the light a little, close your eyes halfway and breathe slowly, because the story you hear tonight may walk through your dreams as well. And before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a gentle comment. Because it's only with your support that these stories can be told, even though some stories were never meant to be spoken. Gaius Caligula, the mad emperor of Rome. Bedtime history for sleep, dark, slow, hypnotic narration, on a quiet Roman night nearly 2,000 years ago. When the empire stretched like a vast shadow across the known world, a child was born who would someday shake that very empire to its core. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, but the world would remember him by the soft, almost playful nickname his father's soldiers whispered with affection: Caligula, Little Boots. It is strange how history works, how a child once adored, kissed on the forehead by hardened Roman legionaries, could one day become a symbol of terror, madness, and the horrifying darkness that absolute power can create. But history is filled with such cruel ironies, and Caligula was perhaps one of the cruelest. He was born into power, into gold, into the roar of armies and the glow of torches blazing across victory camps. His father, Germanicus, was the pride of Rome, noble, fearless, beloved. And his mother Agrippina the elder carried the blood of emperors in her veins. Caligula grew up not in a quiet home, but in the heart of the Roman legions, surrounded by soldiers' steel and the cold discipline of war. As a tiny boy, he wore a miniature soldier's uniform, little boots, little cloak, little sword. The men adored him. They believed he was the future of Rome. They believed he would grow into a leader as brilliant as his father. When they chanted Caligula, the boy laughed. He did not know that the name would follow him long after the laughter stopped. But history changes with a single breath. One winter morning in the year 19C, Germanicus suddenly fell ill. His skin turned pale, his breath short, his strength fading like a candle dying in the wind. Rumors spread through the empire like poison through a vein. Some whispered that Tiberius, the emperor and Germanicus's own uncle, had ordered him killed. Others claimed treachery, jealousy, political fear. The truth was lost to time. But what mattered was simple: Germanicus died, and with him died Caligula's childhood. His mother Agrippina accused Tiberius publicly. She demanded justice. She demanded answers. But Rome did not answer. Rome punished. One by one, Caligula's brothers were exiled, starved, quietly killed. His mother was dragged across the empire, humiliated, beaten, imprisoned until she, too, faded away. And there he was, a small boy standing in the ruins of what had once been a glorious family. A child who learned too early that power smiles with one hand and strangles with the other. Tiberius sent him away to the island of Capri, to live under the emperor's watchful, suspicious eyes. Capri was not a paradise. It was a place where shadows whispered and secrets lived behind every curtain. Tiberius, once a powerful ruler, had become a reclusive old man drowning in fear and indulgence. The palace was filled with cruelty dressed as entertainment, pleasure twisted into something darker. But Caligula learned. Caligula adapted. He hid his anger behind a smile, his fear behind obedience. He studied the art of survival, not with teachers and books, but by watching monsters at work. And slowly, quietly, he became something else. When Tiberius died in 37 C, Rome erupted into celebration. The cold emperor was gone, and in his place stood the son of Germanicus, the boy the soldiers had once adored, the boy who promised hope, generosity, renewal. Caligula entered Rome not as a tyrant but as a savior. Flowers rained upon him. Crowds cheered with a joy the city had not felt in years. And at first he deserved it. He freed political prisoners. He reopened temples. He ended the cruel trials Tiberius had enforced. He gave the people games, gifts, feasts that lasted for days. Rome felt alive again. It felt warm again. It felt human again. But then, the change came. Some say it was an illness, a fever that burned through his mind like wildfire. Others whisper poisoning. Some believe it was madness waiting all along, finally set free. Whatever the cause, when Caligula rose from his sickbed, he was not the same man. Something behind his eyes had shifted. Something in his voice had hardened. The warmth of his early rule faded into something chilling and unpredictable. And Rome began to tremble. Caligula no longer saw himself as emperor. He saw himself as divine, a living god walking in human shape. He ordered statues of himself placed in temples. He demanded that senators bow before him, not as citizens to a ruler, but as worshippers to a deity. He changed ceremonies, rituals, festivals, reshaping the very identity of Roman religion around his own image. He walked through the palace as if walking above the earth, untouchable, unquestionable, infinite. He drained the empire's treasury not on armies or public works, but on unimaginable luxuries. Marble floors imported from distant lands, palaces decorated in gold leaf and gemstones, feasts where guests dined on pearls dissolved in vinegar simply because the emperor found the idea amusing. Officials who tried to question him vanished. Those who whispered doubts were executed. Senators, proud men of noble birth, were forced to run beside his chariot like slaves. He delighted in humiliation. He delighted in power. He delighted in reminding Rome that its fate lay in the hands of one man, a man who no longer saw the difference between cruelty and entertainment. He once invited guests to dinner, smiled at them warmly, and then burst into laughter when he casually ordered soldiers to drag a few away for execution, just to watch the horror on the surviving faces. His cruelty spread like a dark fog. Friends were not safe. Allies were not safe. Family was not safe. His beloved sister Drusilla, whom he elevated to divine status after her death, was said to have shared a relationship with him that crossed the boundaries of family. Whether true or whispered exaggeration, it did not matter, because the rumor fed the city's growing fear. Caligula began to play with the idea of replacing Rome itself, replacing the Senate, replacing leadership, replacing tradition. One of his most infamous acts was his treatment of his horse, Incitatus. Caligula built the animal a marble stable. He fed it oats mixed with gold flakes. He dressed it in purple, reserved only for emperors and gods. And then, with a soft, mocking smile, he announced that he would appoint the horse as a consul. Was he serious? Was it a joke? Was it madness? Rome did not know. Rome only knew that the line between insanity and cruelty had vanished. His paranoia deepened. He trusted no one. He saw betrayal in every glance, treason in every whisper, and as fear grew in his heart, the cruelty grew sharper, colder. He ordered soldiers to march to the English Channel to wage war, not against another kingdom, but against the god of the sea, Neptune. When they arrived at the shore, instead of fighting, he commanded them to collect seashells as spoils of war. A victory over an ocean. The empire watched with a silent, breathless disbelief. This was not a ruler. This was not a leader. This was a storm wearing a crown. Caligula's nights were filled with orgies, violence, and unpredictable rage. His days were filled with decrees that made even his loyal supporters question their loyalty. He demanded new taxes on marriage, on lawsuits, on prostitution. He even discussed taxing the very entrances to the city, and the air citizens breathed within it. He rebuilt his palace so that it connected directly with the temple of Jupiter, creating a bridge between himself and the gods. Because in his mind, the distinction no longer mattered. The empire, once steady and strong, now walked on trembling legs. The Senate feared him. The people resented him. His guards obeyed him but watched him with caution, sensing the danger growing each day. Caligula reveled in his power. But power built on terror is like a candle burning too quickly, bright, hot, and doomed to die. Whispers spread through the palace corridors. Soldiers exchanged glances. Senators held secret meetings. Alliances formed in quiet rooms lit only by small oil lamps. And in the shadows, a single idea began to take shape, a thought born out of desperation, fear, and the final instinct of survival. The idea that the mad Emperor of Rome must be stopped. Mary, Queen of Scots, a tragic nightfall in history. Bedtime story, slow, dark, hypnotic for sleep, in the dim glow of a distant Scottish dawn, when the mist still clung to the mountains like a shroud and the world felt young, fragile, and heavy with secrets. A child was born who would one day walk through life like a candle carried into a storm. Her name was Mary Stuart, the girl who entered history not with triumph, but with tragedy written softly in her shadow. A queen from her very first breaths, and yet destined for a life of heartbreak, betrayal, and a final silence beneath the winter sky. Imagine for a moment that you are drifting deeper into rest, and the soft echo of ancient footsteps begins to guide you. Soft, slow, and sorrowful. That is the sound of Mary's story, never rushed, never loud, always trembling with the weight of everything she would lose. She was born in 1542, into a world trembling with conflict, faith, and political hunger. Her father, King James V of Scotland, heard of her birth and whispered, "It began with a girl, and it will end with a girl." 3 days later he died. And the crown, heavy and cold, slid onto the tiny head of an infant barely old enough to breathe. Mary became queen before she understood the meaning of life, before she spoke her first words, before she saw her first sunrise. And from that moment on, the world began shaping her destiny, tugging her between nations, faiths, alliances, and ambitions that would one day shatter her. As you listen, breathe slowly, and feel the story settle around you like a dark, velvet curtain. Because Mary's life was a quiet storm, beautiful, fragile, and doomed. To protect the infant queen from English threats, she was sent across the sea to France, a place of warm halls, shimmering tapestries, and political dances disguised as courtly grace. There she grew not as a Scottish child, but as a French princess. Loved, admired, educated in poetry, music, languages, and all the arts of charm and diplomacy. She walked through the golden halls of the French court with elegance far beyond her years. At the age of 15, she married the delicate, soft-spoken Francis, heir to the French throne. Their union promised to bind two kingdoms together, promising peace, prosperity, and security. For a brief moment, just a moment, Mary tasted happiness. She became Queen of France, her crown shimmering with possibilities. But fate, as always, was cruel to her. Francis died suddenly, his young life extinguished like a candle in winter wind. The French court shifted, turned cold. And Mary became a widow at 16, still a girl, still fragile, but now burdened with a grief far too heavy for her age. And so, with nothing left to anchor her in France, she returned to Scotland, a land she had left as a child, a land she no longer recognized, a land already tangled in religious wars and noble rivalries. She walked into a kingdom waiting not for a queen, but for a symbol to manipulate. Her return was not met with soft whispers of loyalty, but with watchful eyes calculating her every step. Scotland was torn between Catholic and Protestant, between external pressures and internal turmoil. And in this storm, Mary, young, inexperienced, and shaped by a foreign court, began her rule already surrounded by traps. Her first political mistake was gentle, almost innocent. She trusted too easily. Her second mistake was fatal. She believed loyalty could be bought with kindness. With time, the court around her grew sharper, darker. Nobles plotted behind her back. Alliances shifted like shadows in firelight. And Mary, though graceful and intelligent, could not navigate this web of conspiracies the way she had danced through the polished politics of France. She needed strength. She needed stability. She needed a partner who could stand beside her in a land filled with daggers. And so she married Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, a handsome, charming young man with royal blood and a dangerous ego. What began as affection quickly rotted into fear. Darnley was jealous of her power, threatened by those close to her, and driven by ambition without discipline. His charm dissolved into drunken anger, reckless decisions, and violent outbursts that echoed through the palace halls. Then came the night that changed everything. Mary's secretary, David Rizzio, a close and loyal companion, was dragged from her presence and murdered, stabbed over 50 times, while she stood helpless, pregnant, trembling in horror. The attackers were Darnley and his conspirators. And something inside Mary shattered that night, a crack that would never fully heal. Her child, James, was born into a kingdom already shaking, and Mary, desperate for safety and strength, made the decision that would seal her fate. She allied herself with James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell, a man bold, powerful, and feared. Some say she loved him, others say she was manipulated, threatened, or even forced. But what mattered to the world was not the truth, only the appearance. When Darnley was found dead, his house destroyed by an explosion and his body strangled in the garden, whispers spread like smoke. Whispers that pointed to Bothwell. Whispers that pointed to Mary. Her marriage to Bothwell soon after deepened the suspicion. To her enemies it was proof. To her allies it was a mistake too great to defend. Rebellions broke out. The nobles rose against her. The people turned their backs. And Mary, carrying the weight of her mistakes and others' treachery, was forced to abdicate, replaced by her infant son. A queen undone? She fled to England, seeking safety in the arms of her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I. She believed Elizabeth would understand, would protect her, would see her not as a threat but as a fellow queen stripped of everything. But Elizabeth saw something else, a rival with a claim to the English throne, and a symbol for dangerous Catholic plots. And so Mary was imprisoned, not for a week, not for a month, not for a year, but for 19 long years. Imagine that, 19 years of cold stone rooms, guarded doors, monitored letters, and fading hope. 19 years of longing for freedom, for air, for the life stolen from her. The days blended into nights, the nights into years. Her beauty faded. Her health declined. But her spirit, wounded, trembling, remained. Throughout those years, letters moved like ghosts between Mary and various groups conspiring to place her on the English throne. Some she supported. Some she knew nothing about. But in the end, it didn't matter. Elizabeth's advisors saw her not as a fallen queen, but as a threat that would never die. And then came the letter that sealed her fate. The Babington plot. A plan to assassinate Elizabeth. A plan Mary was accused of supporting. Whether she intended it or not, history still debates. But once her name was tied to it, the decision was made. The trial was swift. The verdict predetermined. Mary, Queen of Scots, guilty of treason. And so she prepared for her final dawn. On February 8, 1587, Mary walked slowly toward the execution chamber, dressed not in mourning black but in crimson, the color of martyrdom. Her steps were steady, her voice calm, her eyes clear. The tragedy that had followed her since infancy now came to rest upon her shoulders one final time. She forgave her enemies. She whispered prayers. She stood with dignity that had eluded her in life but embraced her in death. Then she knelt. The cold air trembled, and with a single, shuddering moment, the blade fell. Silence followed, a silence centuries deep. And Mary, the queen born in innocence, broken by politics, haunted by betrayal, and swallowed by conspiracies, became a figure of forever tragedy. Her life, like a fragile flame carried through endless winds, flickered, struggled, and finally disappeared into history's dark, quiet night. In the shadowed heart of the Indian Ocean, where the waves breathe against the ancient shores of Madagascar, a story sleeps beneath the red earth, quiet, heavy, and haunted. It is the story of a queen whose name drifts through history like a cold wind through an abandoned forest. Queen Ranavalona, the woman who ruled with a hand of iron and a heart wrapped in storm clouds, a ruler whose decisions carved scars across an entire nation. Her reign did not rise like a gentle dawn, it descended like a slow eclipse, spreading silence, fear, and isolation across the land. And yet, in this darkness, there is a rhythm, a slow, hypnotic pulse of power, ambition, and the unforgiving weight of survival. Tonight, we drift back into that world. A world where one woman shaped the fate of millions, where a kingdom stood alone against the world, and where cruelty became a language spoken in whispers. So breathe slowly, let your mind become still, and follow the story as it unwinds, thread by thread, in the quiet of the night. Ranavalona was not born to be a queen. She arrived in the world as a quiet child, in a land divided by tribes, alliances, wars, and fragile hopes. She was the daughter of a nobleman, not destined for glory, not prepared for royalty, until fate twisted sharply in her direction. Her father once saved the life of the future King Andrian Ampoinamarina, and in return, the king promised that the child born from this loyal family line would one day join the royal household. In Madagascar, promises were not drifting words, they were binding cords woven into destiny. When Ranavalona became part of the royal court, she was surrounded by customs older than memory, rituals that hummed like ancient drums, and politics sharp enough to draw blood without leaving a wound. She observed everything quietly, the alliances, the betrayals, the whispers behind the wooden palace walls. Her eyes, calm yet calculating, absorbed the lessons of survival in a kingdom where trust was a fragile flower easily crushed underfoot. When the king died, his son took the throne, and the court shifted like sand in a restless wind. Power moved, trembled, and sought a new shape. And in that trembling, Ranavalona found her opportunity. When King Radamai died without an heir, the court expected the throne to pass to a male successor from another branch of the royal family. But Ranavalona acted swiftly, quietly, and decisively. She formed alliances in the shadows, persuaded powerful military leaders, and moved with the precision of someone who had waited her entire life for this moment. In the year 1828, she proclaimed herself Queen, Ranavalona I, sovereign of Madagascar. The island did not erupt in cheers. It simply bowed, because resistance meant death. The early days of her rule felt calm on the surface, but underneath, something darker was stirring. The people sensed a change in the air, like the moment before a storm gathers its breath. Ranavalona was determined to protect Madagascar from foreign influence, especially from Europeans who had begun weaving their presence into the island's politics, economy, and religion. The queen saw them not as allies, but as threats waiting patiently to turn her kingdom into a colony. And so, she made a decision that would define her reign. She would isolate Madagascar, cut it off from foreign hands, and guard it with a fierceness that would echo for generations. The world beyond Madagascar grew closer each year. Missionaries, traders, diplomats. They came with fluent tongues, gifts, promises, and hidden ambitions. Ranavalona watched them carefully. She did not trust the smiles, the gestures of friendship, or the soft words about progress and civilization. She felt that foreign ideas were seeds that would one day grow into chains. So she hardened her heart, sharpened her rule, and prepared to defend her kingdom as though she were the last barrier between her people and destruction. Her isolation policy began quietly, then widened like a crack in stone. Missionaries were expelled. Foreign teachers, traders, and advisors were dismissed. Letters from abroad were censored. Any attempt by outsiders to influence Madagascar's internal affairs was treated as an act of hostility. It was a wall of silence built not from bricks, but from fear and iron authority. But isolation came with a price, one paid not by the queen, but by the ordinary people of Madagascar. Her rule grew harsher with every passing year. Forced labor became a cornerstone of her governance. Tens of thousands of men, women, and even children were compelled to work on roads, buildings, and fortifications. They carried stones across mountains, felled enormous trees, built vast highways where their bare feet bled on the hot earth. Many never returned home. Hunger stalked them. Exhaustion consumed them. The land whispered their names as though trying to keep their memory alive. Ranavalona believed that forced labor strengthened the kingdom by binding the people to the state. But the cost was measured in bodies, one by one, then by hundreds, then by tens of thousands. Her justice system was harsher still. Trials of ordeal were common. Accused individuals were forced to drink toxic liquids, walk through fire, or stand at the edge of cliffs. If they survived, they were declared innocent. If they died, their guilt was proven. Fear seeped into daily life like mist from the forest. No one was safe, from the wealthy nobles in their carved wooden houses to the farmers in the hills tending rice fields under the sun. Ranavalona's cruelty was not always loud. Sometimes it was slow, patient, and suffocating. Anyone suspected of conspiring against her was executed, often in public, often with cruel methods meant to warn others. Families disappeared into prisons carved from stone and silence. Some were never seen again. The queen ruled through terror. But she believed it was necessary to protect Madagascar from foreign domination. In her mind, every harsh act was a shield held high against a world eager to swallow her people. But as the queen tightened her grip on the kingdom, the population began to shrink. Disease, famine, executions, isolation, and endless forced labor took a devastating toll. It is said that during her reign, nearly half of Madagascar's population vanished. Entire villages became ghostly. Fields lay abandoned. Forest paths grew quiet except for the distant echo of marching soldiers or weary laborers carrying the weight of the queen's ambitions. And yet, despite the cruelty, despite the suffering, there was something undeniably powerful in her presence. She walked with the calm assurance of someone who believed she alone understood what was necessary to preserve the kingdom. Her voice was steady. Her commands were measured. When she spoke, the court listened in absolute silence. She was terrifying not because she shouted, but because she did not need to. Foreign nations called her the Mad Queen, the female tyrant of Madagascar, and the blood-soaked queen. But within her palace, she saw herself as the guardian of tradition, the last wall against the rising tide of colonization. She believed her cruelty was a shield, not a sword. And in her solitude, surrounded by carved wooden panels and flickering oil lamps, she convinced herself that history would one day thank her. But history rarely thanks those who rule through fear. Still, Ranavalona's reign continued, year after heavy year. Her soldiers patrolled the countryside. Her officials enforced her laws ruthlessly. Her isolation deepened. And the world outside watched Madagascar with frustration and confusion, unable to reach it, unable to influence it, unable to tame the queen who stood like an iron statue between her kingdom and the rest of the world. Even as she aged, her strength seemed untouched. But something within her grew colder. Her paranoia sharpened. She believed conspiracies lurked in every corner, among nobles, foreigners, even close advisors. The executions continued. The forced labor continued. The silence of the isolated kingdom deepened like a breath held too long. By the time the queen's health began to fail, Madagascar was weary, its people exhausted, its population diminished, its land scarred. But still, she held on to power with trembling, stubborn hands. She refused to let go. She refused to change. She refused to bend. When Queen Ranavalona finally died in 1861, the island exhaled, slowly, painfully, as though waking from a long, heavy dream. Her son would take the throne. Foreign influence would return. Roads would open. Missionaries would re-enter. The silence would lift. But the scars of her reign, deep, jagged, unforgettable, would remain in the soil, in the stories, in the bloodlines of families who had lost so much. In the quiet corners of Europe, where old palaces sit like silent witnesses to forgotten sins, there is a name that drifts through history with a chill sharp enough to slip beneath the skin. King Leopold II of Belgium. His name does not echo with the warm pride of national heroes, nor with the noble grace of wise kings. Instead, it hangs in the air like a heavy shadow, whispered, avoided, carried softly by textbooks and memories as though speaking it too loudly might awaken something dark. For beyond Belgium's peaceful streets and gentle architecture, far across the oceans, a different world remembers him with fear, with grief, with wounds that never truly healed. Tonight, in the calm of the night, we walk slowly into that world, into the heart of the Congo, where millions once suffered under the rule of a king they never met, but whose hunger for power touched every breath they took. So breathe gently, let your mind become still, and let the story unfold like a slow, dark river. Leopold II was born in 1835, surrounded by luxury, privilege, and the soft glow of European royalty. But even as a child, there was something cold about him, something distant, restless, unfinished. While other princes played in gardens or studied the gentle arts of diplomacy, Leopold's mind wandered far beyond Belgium's borders. His country was small, almost painfully small compared to the great empires of Britain, France, and Spain. He envied them. He wanted land, vast land, rich land, land that would make Belgium a titan among nations. And deep inside, he wanted something more: personal glory, personal wealth, a kind of power that no European king had ever held alone. When he finally became king, Leopold looked at the map of the world the way a hungry man stares at a feast. Africa, carved into pieces by European greed, appeared to him like an open door. But Belgium had no navy, no colonial history, no political muscle. So Leopold searched for something different, a loophole, a subtle path into empire. And he found it in the forests of Central Africa, where the vast Congo basin lay untouched by European hands. It was a land of rivers that glowed silver under the moon, forests so dense they swallowed sunlight, and people who lived with a rhythm older than time. A place of beauty. And soon, a place of nightmares. Leopold could not simply declare the Congo his own. Other nations would challenge him. So he created a disguise. A mask of kindness. A mask of humanitarian promise. He formed an organization he called the International African Association, claiming that its purpose was to bring science, medicine, Christianity, and civilization to Africa. He spoke softly at conferences, wrote heartfelt speeches, and presented himself as a benevolent guardian who wanted nothing but to uplift the African people. And Europe believed him. They nodded, smiled, applauded. They handed him approval. With paperwork, treaties, and carefully crafted lies, Leopold secured control of a territory 80 times larger than Belgium. But he did not call it a colony. He called it his personal property. The Congo Free State, though there was nothing free about it. Once the doors of Congo closed behind him, the mask fell away. What remained was greed, raw, hungry, impossible to satisfy. At first, he sought ivory, precious and white like the moonlit tusks of elephants. Men were forced into the jungle, whipped, beaten, threatened with death unless they returned with ivory. Villages were burned if quotas weren't met. Families were torn apart. Soldiers known as the Force Publique, Leopold's private army, spread across the land like a shadow with guns. And then came rubber. Rubber changed everything. It was the fuel of the Industrial Revolution. Tires, factories, machines. It became more valuable than gold. When Leopold learned this, the Congo was no longer a distant land to him. It was a treasure chest, a mountain of wealth waiting to be squeezed dry. But rubber did not gather itself. It grew in vines deep inside the forests. And so began one of the darkest chapters in human history. Villagers were forced to collect rubber sap from dangerous vines. They walked barefoot through thorny underbrush, scraped their skin raw, risked death from animals, disease, or soldiers. If they failed to meet their quota, punishment was brutal. Hostages were taken. Women were chained. Children were killed. Villages were erased. And then there were the hands. The Force Publique soldiers used ammunition that was counted carefully. Every bullet fired had to be justified. To prove they hadn't wasted bullets on hunting or sold them secretly, soldiers were ordered to cut off a hand from every body they shot. But often they did not want to waste bullets at all, so they cut off hands without killing. Sometimes they cut off the hands of the living. Sometimes of children. Sometimes entire baskets of severed hands were delivered to officers like grotesque trophies to prove their loyalty. The Congo became a land where the sound of weeping mixed with the rustle of forest leaves. Where the river carried whispers of suffering. Where hope hid like a small animal trembling in the dark. And still, Leopold demanded more. He never saw the cruelty with his own eyes. He sat in grand palaces in Belgium, surrounded by sculptures, velvet curtains, and marble floors. Reports came to him in polite envelopes, summaries of output, profits, resource numbers. He called the people of Congo his children, but he never thought of their names, their families, their suffering. To him, they were not human. They were labor. They were numbers. They were a path to wealth. And wealth poured in. It flooded the streets of Belgium. Leopold used it to build monuments, museums, grand boulevards, and luxurious buildings that still stand today, silent, elegant structures built on the bones of millions. But outside Belgium, the world began to notice. Whispers left the Congo. Missionaries, travelers, and African survivors told stories of mutilation, slavery, starvation, and death. Stories of villages destroyed, families taken, rivers filled with bodies. Stories of fear carried by the wind itself. Europe did not want to believe it. But truth has a way of growing, even in darkness, and soon the world began to listen. Truth drifted slowly across the seas like smoke rising from a distant fire. A few brave witnesses, men who had seen the Congo with their own eyes, refused to let silence bury what they had witnessed. One of them was a British shipping clerk named Edmund Dean Morel. He noticed something strange. Ships going to the Congo were filled with guns and ammunition, while ships returning to Belgium carried tons of rubber and ivory. No trade. No exchange. Only extraction and weapons. Morel realized that such an imbalance meant one simple, terrible fact: the Congo's wealth was being taken by force. He began to write. He wrote articles, speeches, reports, his words quiet at first, then louder, then powerful enough to stir the conscience of nations. But his writings alone were not enough. Then came George Washington Williams, an African-American journalist, who traveled to Congo and saw its horrors firsthand. He described Leopold's rule as crimes against humanity, long before the world even had a name for such wrongdoing. Then came missionaries with more accounts, photographs, testimonies, evidence that could not be ignored. Images of Congolese men with missing hands, women holding lifeless children, entire families punished for quotas they could never meet. These images drifted into European newspapers like ghosts searching for justice. At first, Leopold denied everything. He called the reports exaggerated, lies, attacks against his noble mission. He hired publicists, writers, spokespeople to defend him. He presented himself as a misunderstood humanitarian king. But truth has a patience that outlives denial. And in the Congo itself, the suffering deepened. Imagine the forests, once filled with birdsong, now echoing with the heavy footsteps of soldiers. Imagine villages hiding in fear, mothers pressing their children close whenever distant gunshots cracked through the air. Imagine men walking for days through thorny vines, their bodies weakened by hunger, their minds drowning in exhaustion, only to return with a handful of rubber, knowing it would never be enough. Fear was not a moment, it was a season that lasted years. Men were chained by the neck. Women were taken hostage to force their husbands to meet rubber quotas. Roads were paved with blood and sweat. The forced public burned villages that resisted. They laughed while cutting off hands. They carried whips called chicots, long strips of hippopotamus hide, capable of tearing flesh with each strike. And Leopold, far away in Europe, grew richer with every scream that echoed across the Congo's forests. But something began to shift. Whispers turned into conversations. Conversations into movements. Movements into pressure. Morel partnered with Roger Casement, an Irish diplomat who wrote a devastating report after traveling the Congo himself. Their campaign gained global momentum. For the first time in history, the world was witnessing an organized human rights movement aimed at stopping a king. Meanwhile, Leopold felt the heat. His kingdom of silence was cracking. He tried desperately to cover his tracks. He ordered documents burned, thousands of records turned to ash. He wanted to erase the truth before it reached the world's doorstep. But some things cannot be erased. The Congo itself remembered. The trees, the rivers, the empty villages, the missing generations, the quiet graves hidden beneath the soil. And the survivors, those who had endured the horror, carried stories etched into their memories. But even as the world learned the truth, things inside the Congo did not change overnight. The suffering continued. The quotas remained. The force public continued to terrorize the land. Leopold used every last year of his control to squeeze out as much wealth as possible, treating the Congo like a dying animal from which he could extract its final breath. By the time the international community forced Belgium to take the Congo away from Leopold and turn it into a colony of the Belgian state, the damage was already beyond measure. It is estimated that 10 million Congolese people died during his rule, though some say the number could be even higher. 10 million lives. 10 million stories. 10 million futures extinguished in the shadows of rubber vines and ivory trade. Leopold never admitted guilt, never apologized, never showed remorse. Instead, he continued living in luxury, surrounded by beauty crafted from blood money. He spent his fortune on palaces, on grand gardens, on lavish ceremonies. If anyone questioned him, he brushed them aside like dust on his coat. He once wrote in a private letter, "The Belgian people do not need to know what I do in the Congo." In his mind, he was untouchable. In his mind, he had won. But history does not honor the delusions of tyrants. History remembers what they tried to hide. When Leopold grew old, he became bitter, paranoid, irritable. He feared bad press more than judgment. He feared the truth. He destroyed more documents. He tried to silence more critics. But silence could not protect him, not from time, not from memory, not from the vast shadow of suffering that trailed behind his name. When he died in 1909, the public did not mourn him. As his funeral procession passed through Belgium's streets, crowds of people turned their backs on the carriage holding his body. It was their silent protest, their final statement, their refusal to honor a man who had brought shame to their country. Back in the Congo, life did not suddenly become peaceful, but something subtle shifted in the air. It was the absence of one specific darkness, the absence of a king whose greed had reached across oceans. The land began its slow recovery, though the wounds were deep. Scars remained in stories passed down through families, in lullabies sung softly at night, in memories that hurt even generations later. And tonight, in the quiet hours of the world, when the sky is dark and gentle, the story of Leopold II drifts like a slow, haunted wind. His name stands not as a figure of power, but as a warning of what happens when greed becomes a god, when a king sees people as stones to be broken, not souls to be cherished. The forests of the Congo remember him. The rivers remember him. History remembers him. A ruler who never stepped foot into the darkness he created, yet whose shadow covered millions. And as night settles deeper, his story moves like a quiet echo, reminding us that even in silence, truth survives. Even after Leopold's death, the Congo continued to whisper his name in shadows. The forests seemed to murmur, the rivers to carry secrets of a time when human lives were measured in weight, rubber, and ivory. Children grew up listening to stories that were not stories at all, but memories passed down like a warning. The greed of one man can shadow generations. Families remembered what they had lost, parents, siblings, friends, taken by the endless machinery of exploitation. And still, Leopold's name lingered, almost as though it had seeped into the soil itself, staining it permanently. The truth of his reign was so immense, so heavy, that even today, historians struggle to grasp it fully. Millions had perished under his commands, yet the documents he destroyed, the lies he propagated, and the illusions he maintained made it difficult for the world to comprehend the scope of his cruelty at the time. Letters and reports smuggled from the Congo described entire communities disappearing, villages burned, children forced into labor while the elders were executed. The human cost was staggering, each number in the ledger a life erased, a song silenced, a story cut short. Imagine the forests, dense, green, endless, once home to vibrant life, now filled with echoes of suffering. The jungle seemed to mourn, stretching its shadows over the rivers that had carried canoes filled with terrified families, forced to paddle miles under the watch of soldiers whose presence was a promise of pain. Rubber vines became instruments of oppression, their sap harvested not for trade, but for survival under the lash of whips and bullets. The land itself became complicit in the terror, silent witness to a massacre hidden from the eyes of the world. yet vivid in memory and in flesh. Leopold's soldiers, the force public, moved through villages like shadows carrying death. Every failure to meet rubber quotas was met with punishment so horrifying that fear became a constant companion for the people. Children were taken hostage to enforce obedience. Hands were severed, often without killing, as proof that bullets were not wasted. Elders who resisted were hanged or shot, and their villages burned. Starvation and disease followed wherever the forced labor went, compounding the agony. And Leopold, in his palaces across the ocean, counted the profits with calm detachment, never once stepping foot into the forests that hid the bodies of those who had suffered for his wealth. Even as international pressure mounted, Leopold continued his empire of extraction. Reports reached Europe, photographs arrived, and testimonies were collected by brave journalists and activists. Yet the king denied, dismissed, and obfuscated, keeping up the veneer of philanthropy. He argued that his intentions were noble, that the Congo was civilized under his guidance. But there could be no justification for the suffering, the millions of dead, the mutilated, the orphaned. Every coin in his European coffers was a life extinguished, every luxurious palace a monument to blood and sweat. Leopold's obsession with control never wavered, even as critics shouted from the capitals of Europe. He monitored every report, every shipment, every act of defiance in the Congo. Paranoia became a companion. He feared being exposed, yet never feared the destruction he caused. His isolation from the suffering he wrought made him both untouchable and monstrous. While the world began to awaken to the horrors in his colony, Leopold continued to tighten his grip on the land through fear, propaganda, and brutal efficiency. The Congo, despite everything, survived. Its rivers kept flowing, its forests grew back slowly, and its people endured, remembering the past in quiet, unbroken resilience. Even as the Belgian state finally took control from Leopold in 1908, the scars remained. Generations were lost. Cultures were disrupted. Communities were fractured. And yet, from the ashes of oppression, stories of resistance, courage, and survival began to emerge, whispered through songs, rituals, and family histories. Leopold II's legacy is therefore twofold: a record of unimaginable cruelty, and a reminder of human endurance. He is remembered as a king who ruled without compassion, who used his position for personal gain, who valued wealth over life, and who turned a vast territory into a personal playground of terror. But he is also remembered because the people of the Congo survived, and their stories continue to be told, even centuries later. The rivers, forests, and villages became living memorials, silent witnesses to both suffering and resilience, carrying the memory of those who could not speak for themselves. In his palaces, Leopold slept in comfort. In the Congo, millions went to bed with fear, exhaustion, and hunger gnawing at them. He feasted while they starved. He celebrated while they mourned. And yet time would reveal what power alone cannot erase: memory, truth, and the long shadow of history. Leopold's name, once a whisper of distant European royalty, became synonymous with cruelty. It is mentioned slowly, reverently, even in horror, as one recounts the scale of his ambition and the depth of his depravity. Every ledger, every shipment, every act of forced labor, every hand severed in the forests, all became testimony to a ruler who turned human lives into commodities and whose empire was built on terror rather than governance. Tonight, as the moon rises above the distant Belgian streets, and the oceans that carried his wealth stretch silently to Africa, his story drifts through time like smoke. It is heavy, haunting, impossible to ignore. And as we lie quietly, the mind drifting towards sleep, it carries the weight of millions of voices, calling softly from the forests, from the rivers, from the hearts of a people who endured what no human should endure. King Leopold II was never punished in his lifetime. He never witnessed the full consequences of his actions firsthand. But history remembers, in vivid detail, the scale of his crimes, the suffering he caused, and the resilience of those who survived. The Congo is no longer his property. Its people survived. Its land endures. And in that quiet endurance lies the true measure of humanity's ability to endure even the darkest reigns. And so, as night deepens and the world drifts into sleep, we remember a king who lived in luxury while millions perished, a king whose greed spanned oceans, a king whose shadow stretches across generations. And in remembering, we honor the lives lost, the hands cut, the families destroyed, and the resilience that overcame even the harshest cruelty. Imagine a cold, endless Russian night, a sky heavy with frost, a silence so deep it almost feels alive. And in that darkness, centuries ago, a story began, one that began in innocence, in promise, in the quiet hope of a young ruler destined to shape a vast land, yet slowly, steadily, that story drifted into shadow. Tonight, as you listen, as your breath softens, as the world around you settles into quiet stillness, let yourself drift into the life of a man whose name still echoes through history like a distant winter storm, Ivan IV, known to the world as Ivan the Terrible. He was Russia's first Tsar. A child who grew up in palaces but never knew warmth. A boy surrounded not by affection, but by cruelty, by betrayal, by hunger for power from those around him. And that loneliness, that early, sharp, unkind loneliness, would shape his heart in ways even he could not understand. When he was crowned, he was young, too young to carry the weight of a nation, but he carried it anyway, and in the beginning, he carried it well. His early years as ruler were almost gentle compared to what would come later. He passed reforms, supported justice, strengthened the army, and imagined a Russia that could be stronger, fairer, more united. His vision was bright, and for a moment, the land seemed ready to prosper under a new, hopeful Tsar. People whispered that perhaps, after years of chaos, Russia finally had a leader who would guide them toward peace. But the human heart is delicate, especially when it carries the memory of childhood wounds. And for Ivan, those wounds never healed. They lingered, hidden beneath the robes of a ruler, quiet, patient, waiting. He married Anastasia, a woman whose presence softened him, grounded him, gave him a sense of calm he had never known. With her, he felt human, understood, almost safe. The country flourished under their union. She was his anchor in a world filled with shifting loyalties. And then she died. Her death struck him like a lightning bolt in a silent forest, sudden, devastating, echoing without end. Ivan believed she had been poisoned by boyars who resented his power, and whether this was true or not, the belief consumed him. Something inside him cracked, quietly at first, then violently, until the crack became a chasm. The gentle ruler receded, fading like mist at dawn, and in his place emerged a man driven by suspicion, fear, and a need for control so absolute it left no space for mercy. The land began to tremble beneath his feet. Ivan's mind grew haunted, by enemies real and imagined, by conspiracies he believed were everywhere, by shadows and corners that may or may not have existed. His anger became unpredictable, sharp, volcanic. And when a ruler holds absolute power, even the smallest spark of paranoia can ignite an entire empire. From this darkness emerged one of the most chilling creations in Russian history, the Oprichnina. It was more than a policy, more than an institution. It was a state within a state, a machine built to sow terror. Ivan divided Russia in two, the land under traditional rule, and the Oprichnina, his personal domain, controlled by a secret police who answered only to him. These riders, dressed in black, moved across the land like shadows on horseback, carrying symbols of death, brooms to sweep away enemies, severed dog heads to sniff out treason. They rode swiftly, silently, unpredictably, and behind them they left ashes, bodies, broken families, ruined villages. The Oprichniki dragged nobles from their estates, confiscated lands, tortured suspected traitors, executed thousands. The sound of hooves outside a home became a sound of doom. And Ivan watched it all unfold with a chilling calm, believing he was cleansing his country, purifying it from betrayal, strengthening it through fear. Russia became a land of whispers. People spoke quietly, lived cautiously, breathed carefully. Fear settled into daily life like fog settling over a river at dawn, cold, soft, inescapable. Yet beneath his rage, Ivan was still human, painfully human. He was capable of love, of grief, of yearning for connection. But those tender parts of him were buried beneath layers of paranoia and sorrow he no longer knew how to control. And then came the moment that would define him forever. One day, in a fury sparked by a disagreement, some say over politics, some say over a pregnant wife, some say simply over the weight of his own demons, Ivan struck his eldest son, Ivan Ivanovich. The blow was impulsive, desperate, uncontrolled. The prince fell, bleeding, and did not rise. As the life drained from his son's body, witnesses say the Tsar collapsed beside him, holding him, sobbing, begging the heavens to undo what had just happened. But history leaves no room for undoing. He had killed the person he loved most, the heir he had raised, the only soul who could have steadied Russia after his death. In that moment, something inside Ivan shattered so completely that even he could not hide from it. The cruelty that had defined his later years had finally turned inward. The man who had brought terror to his nation tasted the deepest terror of all, regret. And the land felt it. The palace felt it. The people felt it. The silence after the prince's death was heavier than any winter snow that had ever fallen on Russia. Ivan lived on, but he was no longer whole. His rule continued, but the flame inside him flickered unsteadily. His violence persisted, his paranoia lingered, but his spirit dimmed. He wandered through palaces filled with memories he wished he could erase, shadows he wished he could escape, and ghosts that followed him everywhere he went. And outside, Russia waited, fearful, exhausted, loyal, and terrified at the same time. A vast land trembling beneath the footsteps of a ruler whose heart held both great vision and great darkness. And so the years continued, heavy and trembling beneath the weight of the Tsar's shifting moods. The man who had once dreamed of a stronger, unified Russia now drifted through the echoes of his own mind, a place filled with fear, suspicion, and the haunting memory of the son he had struck down with his own hands. In the silence of the palace, when the torches burned low and servants walked softly through the halls, one could almost feel the air thicken with the burden he carried, a burden he could neither set down nor escape. He wandered through chambers filled with icons, touching the cold surfaces as though hoping they could cleanse the shadows inside him. At times, he prayed with a desperation that almost reached tenderness. And then, moments later, he turned away from the altar to order yet another execution, another torture, another purge. His heart was a shifting landscape, moments of sorrow swallowed whole by waves of anger, flashes of clarity drowned beneath storms of suspicion. Russia watched him move between these states like a man walking through fog, sometimes seeing clearly, sometimes stumbling blindly, never quite certain where the path beneath his feet might lead. Outside the palace walls, the land groaned beneath the consequences of his fear. Entire regions were emptied, either by flight or by force. Villages burned, fields stood abandoned, families vanished into prisons from which they never returned. And yet, to those who only knew the Tsar from a distance, his power seemed unbreakable, his rule eternal. They saw only his armies, his banners, the vast stretches of land under his command. They could not see the fracture within him, a fracture that widened with every decision he made. He trusted no one. Advisors approached him cautiously, choosing each word with care. The boyars he had once feared now feared him 1,000 times more. Even within his court, conversations grew quieter, interactions more careful. A misplaced glance could be seen as treason. A hesitation, death. Servants learned to keep their eyes low, their breath soft, their movements invisible. Life under Ivan became an endless performance, a delicate balance between obedience and survival. And yet, for all the terror he inspired, Ivan was not a creature of pure darkness. There were nights when he spoke in quiet tones, reflecting on scripture, philosophy, the burdens of ruling a vast and wild land. There were moments when he wondered, softly, almost childishly, whether he could have been remembered differently if life had been kinder to him, if betrayal had not nipped at his heels from the moment he could walk. In those brief flashes, one could glimpse the ruler he might have been, the man who had once dreamed of justice, wisdom, and unity. But those moments never lasted. They flickered, then disappeared, swallowed by the restless storm within him. His paranoia continued to grow, twisting like a vine around his thoughts, choking away any tenderness before it had time to bloom. He suspected everyone: friends, counselors, family members. And as the list of people he trusted shrank, the Alpernina grew more extreme, more violent, more desperate to fulfill his shifting desires. The terror he unleashed reached its peak in the city of Novgorod, a place he believed was plotting against him. Filled with rage and fear, he rode there with his black-clad Oprichniki, and what followed became one of the darkest chapters in Russian history. Thousands were dragged from their homes, drowned in the freezing Folkhof River, beaten, burned, executed. Entire families, old men, mothers, children, perished under the weight of his imagined betrayal. The city cried out, and the sound of that suffering traveled across Russia like a cold wind carrying a warning no one dared to speak aloud. After Novgorod, even his most loyal supporters began to sense the unraveling of their Tsar. They saw the toll his rage was taking on him, his sudden outbursts, his long stretches of brooding silence, the unpredictable shifts of emotion that left everyone around him uneasy. His health, too, began to decline. Years of stress, guilt, fury, and constant tension carved lines into his face and left his body weak. But even as he weakened, he clung to his power with iron determination, terrified that the moment he loosened his grip, the enemies he imagined everywhere would descend upon him. He remarried more than once, seeking comfort, seeking stability, perhaps even seeking a fragment of the warmth he had lost with Anastasia. But none of those unions brought him peace. The palace remained a place of suspicion and whispers. Children were born, hope briefly stirred. And then chance, illness, or misfortune repeatedly snuffed out whatever light seemed to appear. And all the while, the memory of his dead son followed him. It lingered at the edge of his thoughts like a shadow he could not turn away from. Some nights, he was heard crying out during his prayers, his voice shaking, pleading for forgiveness. Other nights, rage consumed him again, and he convinced himself that he had been provoked, that his son had defied him, that he had acted as any ruler must. The contradiction tore at him, leaving him restless, irritable, exhausted. Yet despite all this, he continued to shape Russia in profound ways, centralizing power, expanding the territory, building the foundations of the autocracy that would define the nation for centuries. His reign was marked by destruction, but also by transformation. He was both creator and destroyer, builder and breaker, a man whose legacy was as vast and conflicted as the land he ruled. And then, one day, in 1584, the end quietly approached. Ivan, older, heavier, weakened by years of turmoil, sat down to play a game of chess. The room was dim, the air thick with the smell of burning lamps. Advisors stood nearby, watching him closely, as they always did, never fully certain whether a calm moment might suddenly turn violent. The game progressed slowly, each move made with deliberate care. Then, without warning, Ivan collapsed. The board shifted beneath his falling hand, pieces scattering soundlessly across the table. Advisors rushed to him, calling out, but his eyes were already clouding, his breath fading. And there, surrounded by the echoes of his own turbulent life, Russia's first Tsar took his final breath. Those who witnessed it said the room felt strangely quiet afterward, as though the walls themselves were unsure how to exist without the storm that had raged within them for so many years. Outside, the cold Russian wind moved across the land he had shaped, carrying with it the memory of the boy who grew up in fear, the ruler who sought greatness, and the man who lost himself to his own darkness. And as night settled again across the Russian horizon, the story of Ivan the Terrible drifted into the long river of history, complicated, tragic, unforgettable, a story forever divided between light and shadow, love and violence, creation and destruction. A story that, even now, lingers like a fading echo, soft, distant, and haunting. In the soft, dim glow of a candlelit chamber, in a world where the shadows of ancient cathedrals stretch long across cobblestone streets, there once lived a figure whose name would echo through history with a strange, unsettling mixture of disbelief and dark fascination. Tonight, as you listen, as your breath settles into a slow, quiet rhythm, Let yourself drift gently into a story that begins not with holiness, but with contradiction. A story about a young man who rose to one of the holiest offices in the world, only to become one of the most scandalous rulers the Church had ever known. His name was Octavianus, but the world would remember him as Pope John XII. He was young, far too young, when his journey began. Barely 18 years old, not yet hardened by the world, not yet shaped by discipline or reflection, still carrying the restlessness and impulses of youth. And yet, through a maze of political maneuvering, powerful families, and the ancient Roman nobility's hunger for influence, he was elevated to the position of Pope, the spiritual leader of millions, the guardian of Christendom. Rome held its breath. People whispered to one another in the narrow, echoing corridors of the Lateran Palace, wondering how someone so inexperienced, so untouched by spiritual calling, could rise to such unimaginable power. But power, in those days, moved like a river through the hands of noble families. It was not always earned. Sometimes it was given. Sometimes it was taken. And sometimes it simply fell into the hands of someone unprepared to bear it. At first, the city waited, quiet, cautious, curious. They hoped, perhaps, that the weight of the office would steady him, shape him, guide him. They hoped that the title of Pope would soften his youth into wisdom. But the palace walls soon began to whisper a different tale, a tale of wild nights, of unchecked desires, of choices that moved further and further away from the sacred vows he had sworn to uphold. He excommunicated those who challenged him. He rewarded those who indulged him. He made promises he quickly broke. And all the while, rumors spread like a soft, steady wind across Europe, rumors of his behavior, his appetites, the life he lived behind closed doors. Some said he turned the palace into a place of sin. Others said he treated the papacy as a game, a privilege rather than a calling. Others whispered darker things, stories meant to shock even the most worldly citizens of Rome. Whether all of them were true or not became less important than the fact that the world believed them. Politically, he was equally unpredictable. He allied with powerful nobles one moment, then turned against them the next. He threatened excommunication like a weapon, but also offered forgiveness without reason, sometimes for gold, sometimes for loyalty, sometimes for reasons known only to him. But the greatest shift in his life, the one that would change the story of his papacy forever, came when he crossed paths with Otto, the King of Germany. Otto, strong, ambitious, seeking to shape the Holy Roman Empire, and John XII, young, impulsive, in need of protection against his enemies in Rome. Their alliance was uneasy from the start, a fragile bond between two men who needed each other but trusted no one. John crowned Otto as emperor, but the moment the ceremony was done, doubt began to creep into his thoughts. He feared Otto's power. He feared his influence. He feared the possibility of losing control. And so, even as Rome celebrated, the seeds of betrayal had already taken root. And Rome felt it. In dark corners, in the quiet spaces of monasteries, in the echo of footsteps across church floors, the unease grew. The Pope's behavior was no longer simply scandalous, it was dangerous. His alliances turned the city into a battlefield of secrets. His decisions placed Rome on the edge of chaos. And his restless, unpredictable heart, always searching for pleasure, always seeking something more, pulled him further and further away from the path of faith. The Church had seen corrupt popes before, and it would see them again. But John XII was different. His youth made his mistakes sharper, his impulses stronger, his disregard more striking. The contrast between his title and his actions created a tension that could be felt even in the quiet rustle of candle flames in the Vatican halls. And all of this, all the scandal, all the politics, all the danger, was only the beginning. For the world of Pope John XII was about to plunge deeper into betrayal, deeper into conflict, deeper into a downfall that would shake Rome to its foundations. Pope John XII whispered shadows of a fallen throne. If you're lying down now, if your breathing has slowed just a little, then let the rest of this story unfold like a dim candle flickering in a forgotten corridor of history, soft, steady, unhurried, because the final years of Pope John XII were not loud, or grand, or royal. They were strangely quiet, like a storm that had already passed, leaving only the smell of wet stone and damaged earth behind. And tonight, we walk through that silence together. The Pope who stopped caring, as months turned into years, John XII began to drift further away from everything he was supposed to be. Even the Vatican whispers softened, not because things had improved, but because people were too exhausted to speak anymore. A strange calm settled over Rome, a calm not born from peace, but from resignation. People often said the Pope is not ruling anymore. He is simply existing. He would disappear for days, sometimes weeks. No councils, no decisions, no leadership. It felt like Rome had a ghost sitting on the throne. And yet, this ghost still held immense power. Power he barely used. Power he barely understood anymore. Power he had simply grown tired of. The empire's eyes turned toward Rome, far away, in his cold stone halls. Emperor Otto I continued watching, quietly, patiently, knowing that one day, the decay would reach a breaking point. He received letter after letter, accusations, reports, pleas from Roman nobles. Some letters begged him to intervene. Some warned him of John's unpredictable behavior. Some blamed him for not acting sooner. But the emperor waited because stepping into Rome meant stepping into a world where religion and politics were tangled like thorny vines. Still, every rumor made those thorns tighter. And each whisper of the Pope's behavior became a weight on the emperor's conscience. He knew. Eventually, he would have to return. Small echoes of an inevitable confrontation drifted across Europe, soft, steady, heavy, like distant thunder rolling across the horizon. Inside the mind of a fading pope, John XII spent his nights wandering the Vatican halls, not as a ruler, but almost as a restless shadow. He would walk slowly, sometimes barefoot, running his fingers along old stone walls, as if trying to feel the history beneath them. There were moments he looked frightened, moments he looked lost, moments he seemed unsure whether he wanted to run, or hide, or simply disappear. His world had become smaller, quieter, stranger. He trusted no one, not even his closest advisors. Not even the nobles who once protected him, not even the guards who swore loyalty. Everyone, in his eyes, had become a threat. Everyone was a potential betrayer. Every face carried the weight of suspicion. This paranoia slowly consumed whatever remained of the boy pope. And the Vatican, once full of hymns, prayers, and order, felt more like a labyrinth wrapped in shadows. The final betrayal, the moment finally came when Roman nobles decided, enough is enough. There was no anger in their decision, no dramatic rebellion. Just a tired understanding that Rome could no longer survive under a pope who was barely present. They sent messages, quiet, secret messages, straight to the emperor. Messages that said, Rome can no longer breathe. We need stability. The church needs saving. And so, Emperor Otto marched again. Not with rage, not with vengeance, but with a kind of sorrow. He knew what must be done, and he knew the church would not recover until someone else sat on the papal throne. Rome opened its gates without a fight, not out of loyalty, but out of exhaustion. The city felt like a tired old man finally exhaling after years of tension. But when Emperor Otto entered the Vatican, John XII was gone. He had fled, vanished into the countryside, with a small handful of loyalists, leaving the Vatican strangely silent. A throne abandoned. A new pope, and a ghost in the shadows, the emperor did what he believed Rome needed. He appointed a new pope, a calm, steady, reasonable man. The church sighed in relief. But deep in the countryside, John XII was waiting, watching, restless. He refused to accept that his throne had been taken from him, refused to accept that Rome had moved on, refused to accept that the world no longer feared him. He began gathering support, slowly, quietly. Nobles who were dissatisfied, soldiers who longed for chaos, people who still remembered the lavish days of his early rule. Piece by piece, he built a fragile army. And one night, under a moon hidden behind thick clouds, he returned. Rome, unprepared, fell quickly. The new pope fled, Nobles scattered, guards surrendered. And for a brief, flickering moment, John XII sat once more on the papal throne. Not as a triumphant ruler, but like a candle burning its last drop of wax, bright for a moment, then trembling, then fading. He punished those who betrayed him, exiled some, executed others. But even in his revenge, his heart was tired. His mind was slipping. His soul felt hollow. He was a king returned to his kingdom, but unable to rule it. The quiet, strange end, and then, one soft, dark night, his story simply ended. Not in war, not in rebellion, not in a grand struggle for power, but in a room dimly lit, with a small window open to the quiet Roman air. Some say he died of a stroke. Some say he was murdered by a jealous husband. Some say he simply collapsed, the weight of years finally breaking him. No one truly knows. What we do know is this: a pope once feared, once notorious, once uncontrollable, left the world in silence. No crowds wept, no armies marched, no bells rang. Just a soft, strange stillness. A life that began in chaos, ended in quiet. A throne once filled with noise, returned to calm. And Rome, slowly, carefully, began to breathe again. King John, the heavy crown of England's most troubled king, settle in, take a long breath, let your shoulders soften, because tonight, we walk into a part of English history that feels like a dimly lit corridor, a place where shadows carry secrets, and every footstep echoes like memory. This is the story of King John, a king remembered not for greatness, but for everything a ruler fears becoming. And yet, in the quiet rhythm of history, even the most troubled kings leave behind lessons that whisper through time. Let those whispers guide you now, slowly, steadily, as the story begins. The Lonely Prince. Before he was a king, John was a child born into a world where everyone wanted power, and no one wanted to be last. He was the youngest son of Henry II, the king who ruled with iron certainty. John's brothers were strong, skilled, popular, warriors, leaders, chosen by destiny. But John was not chosen, not admired, not expected to rule. He grew up watching others receive what he desperately wished for: praise, trust, responsibility. Imagine a young prince wandering castle halls, always hearing comparisons, always standing in the shadow of someone greater. That kind of childhood leaves marks, deep ones, quiet ones, scars that shape the shadow a man becomes. Maybe this is where the restlessness began. Maybe this is where John learned to fear losing anything he loved. Maybe this is where the seeds of suspicion were planted, seeds that would grow into anger, into greed, into desperation. But destiny has a strange sense of humor. The boy no one expected to rule would one day wear the crown. A crown of uncertainty. When John finally became king in 1199, the throne did not greet him with warmth. It felt heavy, cold, unsteady. England was exhausted. Wars had drained money and drained hope. John inherited a kingdom already bruised, already fragile, already unstable. And instead of healing it, he made the cracks deeper. He was clever, dangerously clever, but lacked the patience and emotional calm that a king needed. His temper was sharp. His trust was fragile. His decisions were rushed, insecure, impulsive. He tried to rule like his father, but did not have Henry II authority. He tried to inspire like his brother Richard the Lionheart, but did not have Richard's charisma. John ruled with fear, because love had never been an option for him. And the kingdom felt it, every part of it. Wars lost in silence. Within a few years, John made decisions that would haunt England for generations. He lost lands in France, lands English kings had ruled for decades. Normandy, Anjou, Maine, territories that carried pride, identity, legacy. Gone. Not through heroic last stands or tragic defeat, but through political mistakes, poor judgment, and a king who underestimated his enemies. To the nobles, it felt like watching family treasures slip into the sea, quietly, unstoppably. And every loss made John more desperate, more angry, more suspicious. Like a man clinging to a rope that is slowly unraveling, John tightened his grip in all the wrong places. He demanded more money, more troops, more loyalty. But the more he demanded, the more the kingdom resisted. The rope kept unraveling. Taxes that broke spirits. To pay for his failures, John began raising taxes. Not gentle increases, but crushing burdens. Nobles groaned. Merchants trembled. Villagers felt their lives squeezed by a king who needed gold, the way a drowning man needs air. John taxed salt. He taxed wool. He taxed land. He taxed inheritance. He taxed anything he could touch, anything he could claim belonged to the crown. His tax collectors became feared shadows. Riding from town to town, carrying orders that felt like winter frost, cold, uncompromising, inhuman. People whispered about the king in taverns, in farms, in quiet corners of villages. They spoke of corruption, of greed, of a ruler who saw his kingdom not as a home, but as a chest to be emptied. And with every whisper, their loyalty slipped further away. A king at war with his own nobles, by now, John trusted no one. He saw betrayal everywhere, in the council chambers, in the royal court, even in the smiles of those who bowed before him. He punished nobles without proper trials, confiscated lands, imprisoned enemies, threatened families. The crown, instead of symbolizing authority, began to look like a cage built of fear. Nobles who once served proudly, now carried anger in their hearts, anger wrapped in silence, waiting, watching, measuring the right moment. John's kingdom was no longer a kingdom. It was a pressure cooker. And everyone knew pressure always seeks a release. The church turns against him. As if the nobles' anger wasn't enough, John also entered a conflict with the church. He refused to accept the appointed Archbishop of Canterbury. He challenged the Pope. He pushed against centuries of religious tradition. And Rome responded, with one of the harshest punishments of the medieval world. England was placed under interdict. Church bells stopped ringing. Marriage ceremonies halted. Burials were denied. The country felt spiritually frozen, cut off from the rituals that gave people comfort. Imagine an entire nation, feeling unsure of its own salvation, because of its king. Even the quietest peasants, who rarely spoke of politics, began to question the crown. Their spiritual world had been dimmed. Their connection to faith had been paused. And the man responsible sat in a golden hall, surrounded by distrust. John eventually surrendered to the Pope, but the damage was done. Trust was shattered. Respect was fractured. A king already viewed with suspicion was now seen as cursed. The gathering storm. By the year 1215, England felt like a dark sky, where lightning is waiting behind the clouds. Nobles whispered in hidden chambers. Knights sharpened swords with quiet purpose. Messengers rode through forests at night, carrying plans wrapped in secrecy. And John, still suspicious, still restless, still afraid of losing control, watched his world tighten around him. It was no longer a question of if the kingdom would push back, but when. England stood on the edge of a moment that would echo across centuries. A moment born not out of hatred, but out of exhaustion. A kingdom tired of fear, tired of instability, tired of being ruled by a king who could not carry the crown. And that moment was the creation of something that would outlive King John by hundreds of years. King John and the birth of Magna Carta. The year is 1215. England feels heavy, as if the entire kingdom is holding its breath. Storm clouds gather above the royal halls. The fields grow quiet. The forests seem to listen. Something is about to break. King John sits on the throne, but the throne no longer feels like a symbol of power. It feels like a seat surrounded by ghosts, the ghosts of decisions made in anger, mistakes born from fear, and losses that press on his shoulders, like invisible chains. The rebels have risen. Not peasants, not common villagers, but the barons, the powerful landowners, the knights, the nobles who once swore loyalty, but now move against the king. With cold determination. They are tired. Tired of the taxes. Tired of the punishments. Tired of a king who rules with suspicion instead of wisdom. They gather like a shadow army, silent but relentless, and demand something unthinkable: limits on the king's power. In a world where kings were seen as chosen by God, the idea is almost dangerous, almost revolutionary. but deeply necessary. And so, the barons approached King John, with their list of demands. A document, a parchment, a promise. A promise the king must sign, if he wants peace. A promise called Magna Carta. Runnymede, a meadow that changed the world. The place is Runnymede, a quiet stretch of meadow beside the River Thames. Nothing extraordinary, just soft grass, gentle water, and the distant murmur of wind. But sometimes history chooses simple places for its greatest moments. On a warm June day, the king arrives, not proudly, not triumphantly, but with the weight of desperation. Across the field, the barons wait. Their horses stand still. Their banners barely move. Their eyes carry a calm, cold certainty. They know the king is cornered. They know he cannot fight them all. They know the kingdom cannot survive another civil war. So they hold their ground, silent, firm, unshaken. John walks toward them, each step heavy, each breath tight. He does not want this. He hates this. But he understands something painful. He has no choice. The meadow becomes a stage, and the king becomes an actor, forced to play a role he never rehearsed. The parchment is placed before him. Words written in careful Latin, lines that would change the future. Lines that say, a king's power must have limits. A king cannot tax without consent. A king cannot imprison without trial. A king is not above the law. For the first time, the crown is being asked to kneel to the idea of fairness. John reads the document slowly, and inside his mind, a storm rages. He feels humiliated, insulted, cornered. But on the surface, he keeps his voice steady. He lifts the quill. His hand pauses for a moment that feels like a held breath, and then he signs. The quill glides across the parchment. A simple motion, soft, silent. But with that soft motion, the world changes. A king has been forced to agree to something greater than himself. The sun sinks lower in the sky. The meadow grows quiet again, and for a brief moment, peace touches the kingdom. However, deep inside John's heart, peace does not live long. The king's fury, John leaves Runnymede with a cold fire inside him. The humiliation gnaws at him. The signatures on the parchment feel like cuts across his pride. He smiles in public, but in the shadows of his chambers, he whispers to his closest allies, I will not keep this. The moment the barons relax, the moment their guard lowers, John plans to break everything they forced upon him. And he does. He sends letters to the Pope, claiming he was coerced, claiming the agreement was unfair, claiming Magna Carta should be invalidated. And the Pope, who sees the barons' demands as a threat to royal and religious authority, agrees. He declares Magna Carta null, void, erased. John feels triumphant, but it is a dark, hollow triumph. Because across the kingdom, the barons feel betrayed. Their patience shatters. Their trust disappears. Their swords rise again. Civil war ignites. England plunges into chaos once more. And John, desperate for control, moves through the kingdom, like a man trying to extinguish a forest fire with his bare hands. Storms, marches, and the end of a troubled reign, John's campaigns take him across England, from castle to castle, town to town, all under the heavy gray sky of a kingdom tearing itself apart. But the king's luck is fading. His allies are fewer. His resources are drained. His reputation is in ruins. Even nature seems to turn against him. During one march, he attempts to cross an estuary, with his treasure, gold, jewels, royal belongings. But the tides rise, the waters swell, and the royal baggage train sinks. The king watches helplessly as the waves swallow his wealth, his symbols of power, his last fragments of security. It feels like a sign, a quiet message from fate, your time is ending. Not long after, John falls ill. Dysentery, or exhaustion, or perhaps a sickness born from years of stress and paranoia. He weakens day by day, moving slowly, speaking softly, eyes dimming like candles in the wind. In October of 1216, in a lonely chamber lit by fading torches, King John breathes his last. There are no grand speeches, no triumphant songs, no glorious farewells. Only a troubled king, tired and broken, slipping quietly out of history. And the kingdom he leaves behind must rebuild itself from the pieces. A legacy he never intended. King John is remembered as one of England's worst kings, corrupt, ineffective, suspicious, and disastrous in war. But ironical, his greatest failure became one of history's greatest achievements. Because the document he tried to destroy, Magna Carta, did not disappear. It survived. It spread. It grew into an idea larger than any king. No leader is above the law. No ruler may govern without accountability. Power must have limits. This idea traveled far beyond John's lifetime. It influenced English law, then American law, then the democratic principles of many nations. The king who brought chaos accidentally planted the seeds of freedom. And that is the strange, quiet beauty of history. Sometimes darkness creates the light that guides the future. King Richard II, the fall of England's fragile king. Settle your breath, let the noise of the world soften. Because tonight our story moves into the quiet chambers of a king who was born to rule, but never learned how to carry the weight of a crown. This is the story of Richard II, a young king with a poet's mind, a dreamer's heart, and a ruler's greatest weakness, fragile pride. Not cruel by nature, not monstrous like some kings of the past, but delicate, like glass placed in the storm of medieval politics. And glass, no matter how beautiful, shatters under pressure. Let us walk slowly through the corridors of his life, where whispers of ambition and echoes of rebellion guide our steps into a kingdom on the edge of collapse. A child crowned too early, Richard was only 10 years old. When the crown was placed upon his head, a crown heavy with war, heavy with responsibility, heavy with expectations, he could not possibly understand. The boy sat upon the throne, his small hands resting on gilded arms, his eyes wide, unsure, lost in a world far bigger than himself. Around him gathered the lords, experienced, ambitious, calculating. They looked at the young king, not as a leader, but as an opportunity. A child ruler meant power to share, power to manipulate, power to shape. And so Richard grew up, inside a court of rival factions, where trust was fragile, and guidance came from men who often wanted more for themselves than for the kingdom. He learned early that kingship was not a fairy tale, it was a chessboard, and he was the piece everyone wanted to control. The shadow of the Black Death's aftermath, England was still recovering from the long, dark shadow of the Black Death. Villages emptied, fields abandoned, families broken. The world felt fragile, uncertain, restless. People needed a strong leader, someone steady, grounded, decisive. Instead, they had Richard. A boy who preferred poetry to warfare, ceremonies to councils, and peaceful gardens over the harsh debates of kingship. But kingdoms cannot be ruled on softness alone. And England soon faced a trial that would test the young king in a way he could not escape. The rising of 1381, a child in the fire, the year is 1381. Whispers of anger sweep through the countryside, peasants, laborers, ordinary villagers, exhausted by taxes and frustrated by rigid laws that kept them trapped in poverty. The pressure builds, like storm clouds gathering above a silent field, until finally, the storm breaks. Tens of thousands rise. A wave of fury, a swell of desperation. They march toward London, with wooden sticks, rusted blades, and the powerful momentum of the oppressed. The capital panics, the court trembles, and in the center of the chaos stands Richard, barely 14 years old. Yet in this single moment, the young king shines. With the courage of youth, with the calmness of someone too young to understand the danger, Richard rides out to meet the rebels. No army, no shield, no veteran warriors to protect him. Just a boy on a horse, face steady, voice calm. Come with me, he tells the rebels. I am your king, and I will be your leader. His words soften the uprising. His presence quiets the rage. And for a brief, fragile moment, Richard becomes the king everyone hoped for. But the moment cannot last. Once the leaders of the revolt are killed, once order returns, once the court regains control, the barons step forward again. The advisors surround him again. The factions close in again. The child king returns to being a puppet, and the young courage he showed slowly fades into the background. A king slow to trust and quick to pride. As Richard grows older, one flaw grows with him, a deep, sensitive pride. He remembers the years when no one listened to him. He remembers the barons who twisted his youth for their gain. He remembers the whispers, the doubts, the lack of respect. So when he finally becomes an adult, when he finally has the crown in his own hands, he clings to authority with desperate force. A king must be obeyed. A king must be honored. A king must not be questioned. And so Richard begins surrounding himself with advisors he trusts, not for their wisdom, but for their loyalty. Men who flatter him, men who agree with him, men who mirror back the image of the king he wants to believe he is. The older, wiser nobles feel ignored, disrespected, pushed aside. The kingdom grows tense. The court grows divided. And Richard, instead of balancing power, leans deeper into favoritism. His decisions become personal, emotional, driven not by strategy, but by wounded pride. He elevates close friends to high positions. He spends lavishly on ceremonies, clothing, feasts, symbols of royal grandeur that England cannot afford. He constructs a royal identity, based not on strength, but on symbolism, pageantry, and the dream of being a perfect king in an imperfect world. But rulers cannot live in dreams, not for long. The Lords Appellant, when nobles rebel, by the late 1380s, the tensions explode. A group of powerful nobles, known as the Lords Appellant, rise to challenge Richard's authority. They claim the king is misguided, poorly advised, reckless with his spending, and dangerously naive. They demand control. They demand reform. They demand the removal of Richard's favorites. And for the first time, Richard feels the same fear he felt as a child. The feeling of being cornered, overpowered, outnumbered. The Lords Appellant seize control of government. Richard's allies are exiled, executed, or humiliated. The king is left surrounded by enemies, forced to watch as others rule in his name. His pride bleeds. His resentment deepens. And deep inside, a slow-burning anger begins to grow, an anger that will one day consume him and destroy everything he has left. A king who remembers every wound when Richard finally escapes the control of the Lords Appellant. He returns to power with a quiet, simmering fury. He has not forgotten. He has not forgiven. He remembers every insult, every humiliation, every noble who dared to stand against him. But he is patient. He waits, he watches, he plans. And when the perfect moment arrives, Richard strikes. He arrests his enemies, imprisons others, exiles those he cannot execute, destroys the families of those who opposed him. One by one, he tries to erase the power of every person who once challenged him. But revenge is a dangerous whisper in the ear of kings, because it does not build kingdoms. It only feeds fear, weakens alliances, and invites ruin. And ruin is already on its way. For across the sea, a man watches Richard's downfall, with quiet calculation, a man who once bent the knee to him, a man Richard has deeply wronged. A man named Henry Bolingbroke. Imagine a kingdom waiting for strength, and receiving instead a boy who never learned how to bend. Not to the storm, not to his people, not even to fate. And as Richard II grew, the distance between the crown he wore and the world he was meant to lead kept widening, like a crack spreading through ancient glass. Now, slowly, let's step deeper into the final years of his reign, the years when pride became a shadow, and the shadow became his downfall. When a king trusts only his reflection, by his early adulthood, Richard had become something England had feared in many rulers before him, a king who listened only to the sound of his own voice. He surrounded himself with favorites. Men who flattered him, praised him, fed his sense of divine authority, while pushing away the nobles who actually held the country together. And in medieval England, alienating the nobles was like removing stones from the base of a tower. It doesn't fall immediately, but the collapse becomes only a matter of time. Richard believed he was untouchable, chosen by God, superior to all earthly judgment. He walked into halls with a regal grace, but behind the grace was a dangerous certainty. I am the king, and a king cannot be wrong. That belief would cost him everything. The shadow of tyranny begins to form when Richard started raising taxes without reason, when he punished nobles for opinions rather than crimes, when he used the law not to guide the kingdom, but to tighten his grip. England began to feel a quiet fear. A fear that whispered, "Our king does not rule us, he rules over us." And slowly, very slowly, Richard began transforming from a gentle, cultured monarch into something colder, something harder, something the people no longer recognized. To him, a disagreement was treason, a suggestion was a threat. Silence was respect, fear was loyalty. And the throne beneath him grew more brittle with every passing season. The return of Henry Bolingbroke, but Richard's greatest mistake was forgetting one simple truth of medieval politics: exiling a powerful man does not erase his power, it only teaches him patience. Henry Bolingbroke, Richard's cousin, had been exiled by the king after a political dispute. Richard expected Henry to vanish from history like a discarded page. But instead, Henry returned, not with anger, not with ambition, but with a clear, calm purpose to reclaim what Richard had taken. When Henry arrived in England, the nation did not resist him. It welcomed him. Because where Richard had demanded obedience, Henry offered stability. Where Richard had ruled through fear, Henry promised order. Where Richard saw enemies, Henry saw opportunity. And for the first time, Richard's throne trembled. Richard's world starts to crumble. When Richard finally returned from Ireland, expecting his kingdom to kneel at his feet, he was met with silence. Not applause, not loyalty, just silence. His armies had dwindled. His supporters had melted away. His nobles were now standing beside Henry. Richard, once proud, once radiant, once majestic, found himself staring at a reality he had never imagined: a king without a kingdom. He surrendered, not dramatically, not heroically, but quietly, like a candle giving up its final ember. And for the first time in his life, Richard II felt what it meant to be powerless. The long road to abdication, he was taken to London, not as a ruler, but as a prisoner of his own arrogance. The halls he once walked with golden confidence now echoed with memories of everything he had ruined. Parliament gathered, nobles watched, and the kingdom held its breath. Richard was presented with the document that would strip him of the crown. He looked at the parchment, then at the men before him. Men he had punished, ignored, humiliated, and he realized this is not a betrayal. This is justice returning home. His hand trembled. His voice softened. And the king who once believed he could never be wrong, signed away the very identity he had clung to all his life. In that moment, England changed forever. A fallen king in a cold castle, after abdication, Richard was taken north, to Pontefract Castle. A place of stone, of silence, of slow, creeping loneliness. There, away from the world, the former king lived like a shadow, thinking, regretting, remembering. Some say he talked to himself, for hours in the dark. Some say he whispered apologies, to ghosts no one else could see. Some say he clung to the hope that Henry would show mercy. But mercy is a fragile thing in royal politics. Henry IV, now king, knew that as long as Richard lived, England would never be fully stable. And so, the quiet end came. Not with a blade on a battlefield, not with a crowd watching, but in a cold room, behind thick walls, where a dethroned king took his final breath. How he died, poison, starvation, execution, remains a mystery. But the silence that followed was unmistakable. A chapter had ended. The legacy of Richard II today, history remembers Richard II not as a tyrant, not as a hero, but as a warning. A warning about pride, about isolation, about the danger of believing power is permanent. He loved art, beauty, poetry, yet he never learned the art of rule. He understood ceremony, but not responsibility. He cherished the crown, but forgot the people beneath it. And that is why his story lingers, because a kingdom can survive cruelty, but it cannot survive a leader who refuses to listen. Imagine a ruler who sits alone in a silent palace, surrounded not by generals, or ministers, or advisors, but by strange metal instruments, half-finished alchemical devices, and paintings of creatures that never existed. Imagine an emperor who looks out from the highest window in Prague Castle, not to inspect armies, not to plan wars, but to watch the stars, searching for meaning in their trembling, distant glow. This was Emperor Rudolf II. A man who held one of the most powerful titles in Europe, Holy Roman Emperor, yet walked through his life like a dreamer wandering through mist. A ruler fascinated more by mysteries than by governance, more by shadows than by sunlight, more by visions than by reality. And slowly, very slowly, his empire would feel the weight of that wandering mind. A childhood of silence and shadows, Rudolf's early years were not filled with warmth. He grew up in the rigid, cold, almost suffocating world of the Habsburg court, a place of rules, discipline, endless ritual, and very little affection. As a young boy, he was quiet, too quiet, observing more than speaking, watching the world with deep, curious eyes that never seemed to rest. Some said he was shy, others whispered he was different. But one thing was clear: inside his mind, the world was far bigger than the rooms he lived in. While other future rulers learned military strategy, diplomacy, law, Rudolf was fascinated by the hidden, the forbidden, the mystical. He devoured books on astrology. He asked questions about spirits. He wanted to understand dreams. He stared at the night sky, as though it were a book only he could read. And slowly, an unusual seed began to grow inside him, a belief that the universe carried secrets that only a chosen few were meant to unlock. Ascending the throne, with the mind of a mystic, when Rudolf became Holy Roman Emperor, many hoped he would bring stability, strength, unity. Instead, they received something far more unpredictable. Rudolf transformed Prague into a world unlike any other place in Europe. Scientists, artists, philosophers, astrologers, alchemists, mystics, they all arrived at his court, like moths drawn to a dim, enchanting flame. He welcomed them, funded them, encouraged them. Not because he wanted political advantage, but because he felt that somewhere in their work, in their experiments, their symbols, their strange formulas, lay the answers that his mind had been searching for since childhood. His court became a labyrinth of curiosity. Rooms filled with rare animals, shelves lined with odd crystals, cabinets holding bizarre treasures, mechanical birds, ancient manuscripts, preserved creatures from distant lands. No other emperor in Europe was building anything like it. And yet, as his obsession grew, so did the cracks in his kingdom. Alchemy, his deepest obsession, to understand Rudolf, is to understand his devotion to alchemy. Not the simple idea of turning metal into gold, but the grander dream behind it. The idea that the world was filled with hidden laws, hidden forces, hidden energies, which only the enlightened could master. Rudolf believed, truly believed, that alchemy held the key to spiritual transformation, to universal truth, to unlocking God's deepest mysteries. So he invited every ambitious alchemist in Europe to his palace. They arrived with glowing potions, mysterious powders, secret manuscripts. Rudolf listened to them with rapt attention, as if they were prophets. Some were brilliant minds, experimenting with what would later become chemistry. Others were frauds, selling illusions and empty promises. But Rudolf never learned to separate the two. He believed, and believed, and believed, and as he believed, the affairs of his empire began slipping out of his hands, like sand falling through open fingers. A court wrapped in magic and fear, Prague, under Rudolf, felt like a city caught between worlds. By day, artists painted masterpieces, inspired by strange visions. By night, alchemists heated substances, until sparks danced against stone walls. Astrologers studied the sky, while whispering predictions that carried both hope and dread. Rumors spread of magical rituals performed in hidden chambers, of creatures preserved in jars that no one could identify, of manuscripts written in codes no scholar could decipher. Some believed Rudolf was enlightened, a king ahead of his time. Others believed he was losing his grip on reality. And their fears were not unfounded. Meanwhile, the empire burned slowly. While Rudolf wandered through dreams and symbols, Europe changed. Threats grew, alliances shifted. But the emperor paid little attention. He delayed decisions, ignored letters, postponed councils, let disputes linger until they became crises. At first, the nobles were patient. They thought the emperor's odd habits were harmless, quirks of a brilliant, eccentric mind. But soon, they realized something darker. Rudolf was not eccentric. He was overwhelmed. He saw omens everywhere, in the stars, in the shapes of flames, in the positions of shadows. He believed prophecies over political advisors. He trusted alchemists more than generals. And the empire, slowly, began sinking into disunity. A mind becoming its own prison. As the years passed, Rudolf withdrew further. Meetings became rare. Public appearances, even rarer. He spent days locked in his chambers, studying strange devices, speaking only to his astrologers, gazing at stars, as if they were old friends. His isolation fed his anxiety. His anxiety fed his fears, and his fears fed the chaos of the empire. Outside the palace walls, Europe whispered that the emperor was drifting into madness. Inside the palace walls, his servants learned to walk softly around a man whose mind was a storm no one could calm. And as his grip on reality loosened, so did his grip on the empire. A brother waiting in the shadows, while Rudolf retreated into his world of dreams and alchemy, one man watched the growing disorder with sharp, patient eyes. Archduke Matthias, Rudolf's younger brother. Unlike Rudolf, Matthias was practical, ambitious, focused. He saw what the nobles saw, what the generals saw, what all of Europe saw. A ruler who no longer ruled. And slowly, quietly, Matthias began gathering supporters. Not with force, not with threats, but with a simple promise: I will lead where Rudolf cannot. The storm that Rudolf felt inside his mind was now spreading outward, into the lands he ruled, into the hearts of his nobles, into the careful balance of Europe. But inside Prague Castle, he did not see the storm. He only saw the dance of golden liquids in alchemical flasks. The glow of constellations traced on ancient charts, the secret diagrams that promised answers to questions only he cared to ask. Outside, the empire shook. Inside, Rudolf drifted. And the distance between those two worlds grew wider with every passing season. A court that waited and waited. Rudolf's ministers tried endlessly to draw him back to reality. They brought reports of rising religious conflict. They warned him of rebellions simmering in the distance. They begged him to settle disputes between princes before they erupted into war. But Rudolf, sitting in a quiet room, filled with the faint scent of heated metals, merely nodded. Always nodding, always promising to act, always delaying. Days passed, then weeks, then months. And the empire felt the slow, suffocating weight of a ruler lost inside himself. Some nights, the nobles would gather in anxious circles, whispering that the emperor was slipping into madness. Other nights, the alchemists whispered that he was on the edge of discovering something extraordinary, a revelation the world was not yet ready to see. But neither prophecy would save him. The empire fractures, religion tore Europe apart in Rudolf's time, Catholics and Protestants, walking a razor's edge between fragile peace and open war. The Holy Roman Emperor was meant to guide that balance, to negotiate, to restrain conflict, to protect unity. But Rudolf would hesitate, delay, withdraw. He feared confrontation, almost as much as he feared failure. Instead of choosing sides, he hid behind silence. Instead of making decisions, he asked astrologers for the alignment of the planets. And the more he hesitated, the braver his rivals became. Princes challenged imperial authority. Cities defied his commands. Nobles ignored his messengers. The empire was no longer an empire, it was a fragile glass sphere in the hands of a man, too distracted to hold it tightly. And everyone knew, who waited patiently, for that sphere to crack. Matthias. The shadow of Matthias grows longer. Matthias understood what Rudolf did not. Power cannot be left unattended. Empires do not wait for dreamers to awaken. So he moved quietly, with the steady confidence of a man who believes his moment is near. He promised protection to Catholic princes, promised stability to nobles tired of chaos, promised strength to generals who feared the empire was drifting toward collapse. With every promise, another pillar of Rudolf's authority shifted away from him. And still, the emperor remained wrapped in a cocoon of mysticism and solitude, unaware or unwilling to accept that the throne beneath him was dissolving like salt in water. A palace filled with wonders and warnings. Inside Prague Castle, Rudolf built one of the greatest collections Europe had ever seen. Strange mechanical devices that clicked and whirred like magical creatures. Paintings by masters who captured beauty in ways the world had never known. Maps of distant lands, minerals of impossible colors, rare animals, bizarre fossils, and manuscripts filled with cryptic symbols. Visitors spoke in whispers as they walked his halls, not out of fear, but out of awe. They saw the treasures of a brilliant mind and the ruins of a failing ruler. One chamber held an extraordinary creature, a taxidermied bird of paradise, from remote Pacific islands, so strange that many believed it had no feet and lived its entire life in the sky. Another room contained alchemical furnaces that glowed late into the night, their light flickering like dying stars across the stone walls. But among these wonders lay something darker: silence. A silence that grew thicker with every year of Rudolf's retreat, a silence that pressed down on the palace corridors like an invisible fog. The court sensed it, the servants sensed it, visitors sensed it. The emperor was fading. The turning point, in 1608, everything changed. Matthias, no longer willing to wait for the empire to collapse entirely, made his move. He marched his supporters toward Rudolf's territories, not with open aggression, but with quiet, confident pressure. The message was clear: let me rule, or watch the empire fall apart. Rudolf, terrified, finally realized what he had allowed to happen. But it was too late. He no longer commanded trust, no longer commanded loyalty, no longer commanded fear. The empire had slipped away from him, without violence, almost without a sound. Like a candle, burning itself out in an empty room. A sad surrender, under growing pressure, Rudolf agreed to hand control of many of his lands to Matthias. For the first time, the emperor who once dreamed of unlocking the secrets of the universe faced a truth he could not escape. He had failed in the one duty he could not ignore. And it broke him. He withdrew even further, avoiding public view, avoiding state matters, avoiding even the people who still loved him. Prague Castle, once alive with curiosity and wonder, became a quiet maze of empty hallways and closed doors. The alchemists left. The artists departed. The scholars returned home. The dream Rudolf created slowly faded into memory. The final years, Rudolf spent his last years, surrounded not by courtiers, but by the remnants of his collections, a globe with fading gold lines, a mechanical lion that no longer roared, a crystal prism that broke sunlight into fragile rainbows, paintings whose colors dimmed in the stillness of his chambers. He wandered the castle, like a ghost, a man trapped between what he was and what he hoped to be. In 1612, he passed away quietly, almost unnoticed, while the empire moved forward under Matthias. The world did not tremble at his death. It simply exhaled, as though a long, strange dream had finally ended. A legacy of beauty and chaos, history remembers Rudolf too, not as a conqueror, nor as a wise ruler, nor even as a tyrant. He is remembered as a mystery. A dreamer, lost between brilliance and madness. A patron of the Renaissance, whose love of beauty gave Europe extraordinary art, extraordinary science, extraordinary curiosity. And yet, a ruler whose neglect and indecision helped push the Holy Roman Empire toward chaos and placed Europe on the road to the 30 Years' War. He was both light and shadow, both creator and destroyer, both enlightened and tragically blind. A man who searched for the secrets of the universe while losing the world he was meant to rule.